If you've been following college football recently, you're likely aware of the controversies surrounding the current structure of the league. We have mega conferences spanning the entire continent, shifting around historical rivalries, expanded playoffs, and a never-ending stream of accusations that rankings have various types of bias. Today, I shall propose a new college football model that should solve all these problems. But first, what are the problems? First, conferences are too spread out. Teams routinely cross half the country to play their regular season games. This means long, expensive plane flights and missed class time. You might not think this is a huge deal for football programs who have infinite money to work with, but think about all the smaller sports like volleyball or baseball, or the beloved marching bands, who simply don't have the same volume of cash. We can measure conference spread by their diameter, the longest distance between two schools in a conference by car. Here they are for the Power 4. SEC, Norman, Oklahoma to Gainesville, Florida, 1,125 miles. Big 12, Salt Lake City, Utah to Orlando, Florida, 2,342 miles. Big 10, Seattle, Washington to New Brunswick, New Jersey, 2,885 miles. And the ACC, Berkeley, California to Boston, Massachusetts is a whopping 3,089 miles. These diameters are not even outliers. Each conference has numerous school pairs which are ridiculously far apart from each other, so I shall prioritize reducing conference diameter. Second, conferences are too large, as in the number of teams. This contributes to the first problem, but is a problem by itself. If you are in a larger conference, you play proportionally fewer games in that conference each year. The Big 10 has 18 teams, but only 9 conference games per year, so each team only plays about half the conference each year. With fewer head-to-heads, we have to rely on confusing tiebreakers to decide who are the best two in the conference. In 2024, the Big 12 had a 4-way tie for first place that had a single head-to-head between them. And teams can go years between playing conference rivals. If we consider a team like SMU, they won't play Duke again until 2030. So, I shall prioritize reducing the number of teams in each conference. Ideally, we have a system where every team in a conference plays every other team in that conference. Third, we have the problem of historical rivalries. While Texas and Oklahoma preserved their famed Red River rivalry while moving to the SEC, they lost secondary rivalries like Texas Tech and Oklahoma State, respectively. Fixed out-of-conference rivalries like Georgia, Georgia Tech, or Iowa, Iowa State still exist, but those are primary rivalries, so I shall try to preserve as many primary and secondary rivalries as possible, only relying on fixed out-of-conference rivalries in historically relevant circumstances. Now that we know our criteria, let's look at the field. There are 67 teams in the Power 4, 69 if you include the Pac-12 remnants, nice, and 70 if you include Notre Dame. This number actually works perfectly for my system, not a single team wasted. I prefer Notre Dame joined a conference, but if they prefer not to, I can promote a group of 5 teams. I tried several conference iterations to get my final result, 9, 10, 12 team conferences with varying geographic logic. I ultimately decided on 8 team conferences with 8 conferences total. The winning setup drew from pre-1990s conference alignment, with some flexing to add all the new teams that have joined the power conferences since then. And here it is, 8 conferences and 70 teams, with an 8-team baseline that leaves 6 teams left over. Not to worry, I put 4 extra in the Pac-12 and 2 extra in the Big 10. These conferences are now confined to a mostly contiguous geographic area, instead of crisscrossing and overlapping all over the place. Let's start with the Big 10. It's just the historical Big 10 conference reborn in the modern day. It has Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Northwestern, Indiana, Purdue, Michigan, Michigan State, and the Ohio State. This conference is the poster child of the ideal football conference. Geographically compact, lots of history and rivalries, and 10 teams means everyone can play everyone during the season. I chose the Big 10 to get 10 teams because the geography works better that way. And the name was already there. Then we have the other so-called super conference, the SEC. It has LSU, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Alabama, Auburn, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, and Kentucky. The historical SEC had 12 teams until Georgia Tech and Tulane left, then 10 teams for 36 years when Arkansas and South Carolina joined. I would have loved to maintain this full 10-team core, but the numbers just didn't work out. Sorry, Florida and Georgia, you're moving out. It pains me to remove all those secondary rivalries, but at least Auburn, Georgia can replace Georgia, Georgia Tech as Georgia's out-of-conference rival. Speaking of Georgia and Florida, the South Atlantic Conference has all the power teams in those states, plus the 2 in South Carolina. Georgia, Georgia Tech, Florida, Florida State, Miami, Central Florida, South Carolina, and Clemson. Miami was a pain point for this conference as it massively increases the diameter of any conference it's placed in. With North Carolina's teams being so tight-knit, sealing Georgia and Florida University was crucial for reaching 8 teams. The North Carolina schools instead go to the North Atlantic Conference. This contains North Carolina State, Wake Forest, Duke, Virginia, Maryland, Rutgers, and Boston College. The Northeast region of the United States was the trickiest bit for me to solve, but an innovation in the North Atlantic Conference allowed a breakthrough. I noticed that Virginia Tech only joined the ACC in 2004 and Syracuse in 2013. Neither are particularly close to the coast, and they have plenty of rivals elsewhere, so they go into the Appalachian Conference. It has Louisville, Cincinnati, West Virginia, Virginia Tech, Penn State, Pittsburgh, Syracuse, and our prodigal school, Notre Dame. I'd say this conference comes out of the old Big East, but the Big East was too much of a mess to establish any history. In fact, many of the teams here were independent for most of their history. However, their regional proximity spawns plenty of rivalries that can now be captured in a conference setting. Going back out west, we have the old Southwest Conference: Texas, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, SMU, TCU, Baylor, Houston, and Arkansas. The old Southwest Conference finished with 9 teams, but Rice has been demoted to G5, so we have a perfect 8. You may be wondering about Texas versus Oklahoma, but they were historically an out-of-conference rivalry, with all their secondary rivals in the Southwest Conference and the Big 8, respectively. Speaking of, we are bringing back the Big 8: Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Kansas, Kansas State, Missouri, Iowa State, Colorado, and Nebraska. Including their time in the Big 12, some of these teams have been together for over a century. Iowa and Iowa State have not shared a conference since 1911, but have maintained a strong out-of-conference rivalry nonetheless. Just like Texas and Oklahoma, all their secondary rivals are elsewhere, so it makes the most sense to keep them apart. With 58 teams conferenced, it's time to head to the West Coast. There's a massive gap down the middle of the country with only 2 power schools, Texas Tech and Colorado. Manhattan, Kansas, and Salt Lake City, Utah are over 1,000 miles apart by road. Considering the historic ties of Colorado and Texas Tech, it makes the most sense to keep them in the East and put the whole West together into one big conference. That unfortunately means it is spread out too, but that is inevitable with so much land area and so few schools. Adding a few Western teams to the Eastern conferences would just make things worse. So I present to you the new Pac-12. They have 12 teams in 2 divisions. In the north, we have Washington, Washington State, Oregon, Oregon State, Stanford, and California, Berkeley. In the south, we have UCLA, USC, Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, and BYU. Though the diameter is higher than I would like, it is the best option available for the Western schools. After all, it is just the old Pac-8 and Pac-10 with the Utah schools added in. Divisions can swap the Utahs with the Northern California schools if rivalries prefer, but what I have reduces division diameter more. There we have it. 8 conferences for a new era. Don't they just look prettier than the abomination we have now? But we don't just want conferences to look pretty, we want them to meet certain criteria. How does this new system stack up? The first improvement is obvious. I have slashed conference diameters by a huge margin. Before, every conference was over 1,000 miles across. Now, all but one conference is under 800 miles across. The Pac-12 still has a lot of travel to do, unfortunately, but that is an inevitable result of geography. I have also shrunk conferences substantially, down from 16 plus teams per conference to 8 plus. What about rivalries? Of the 110 Inter-Power 5 rivalries with a Wikipedia page and at least 50 contests, I was able to preserve all but 25 through conference matchups alone. This is already an improvement over the 27 lost in the current system, and I haven't counted my fixed rivalries yet. Of the 25 rivalries remaining, 5 are monogamous, 4 have an obvious preference, and Nebraska-Minnesota is monogamous after Iowa State is taken. Arkansas, Texas A&M, Ole Miss, and LSU have 3 interconference rivalries between them, so I'll let them decide how to go forward. Florida can pick between Kentucky and Tennessee. Kentucky-Louisville does not qualify as a major rivalry, yet, but is available if Florida chooses Tennessee, or neither. As I wanted, of the 10 rivalries we can definitely preserve, 7 are either current or historically out-of-conference rivalries. Overall, I was able to preserve more and more important rivalries than the current system. Only 10 to 15 rivalries remain unsettled, all with under 100 matchups. The current system leaves 9 over 100 game rivalries unpreserved. Now that we have our conferences, let's see how scheduling will work. We will start with the regular season. For the Big Ten, it's super simple. Play everyone in your conference every year, then you have 3 non-conference games. The Pac-12 is also simple. 5 games against your division opponents, 3 alternating games against your out-of-division opponents, then 4 non-conference games. In an 8-team conference, you have 7 conference opponents. 5 non-conference opponents is too many though. My solution? Ranking games. Every 8-team conference is paired with 2 adjacent conferences. The teams that finish with the same rank in adjacent conferences play each other the following year. For example, if Texas A&M finishes 3rd in the Southwest Conference, Oklahoma State finishes 3rd in the Big 8, and LSU finishes 3rd in the SEC, then Texas A&M plays Oklahoma State and LSU the next year. If Miami finishes 3rd in the South Atlantic Conference, then LSU plays Texas A&M and Miami, and so on around the ring. And what of fixed rivals? Consider Clemson and North Carolina State. If they finish at different ranks, then they will play their rivalry game in addition to their ranking games. If they finish at the same rank, then their rivalry game is a ranking game and they just get another non-conference game to work with. Think of it as though teams voluntarily schedule their rivalry games every year. If their ranking game is their rival, then there's no need to schedule another rivalry game. The most important thing about ranking games is that they count as conference games. They contribute to your conference record, which is used to determine who goes to the conference championship and next year's rankings. If you're good, you will be rewarded with good teams to play. Simple as that. Now, to fix the postseason. On the right is an approximation to how they would look with this season's rankings. First, we have our conference championship games. Then, the playoffs take the 8 conference champions, seed them based on the national rankings, and begin the tournament. Instead of a fixed bracket, the playoffs will use reseeding, so the highest seed will always play the lowest seed. I know some of you have apprehensions about only taking conference champions. After all, it has never been like that before. But in this new system, it makes sense. Think of the playoffs as starting with conference championships. That means the top 2 of every conference makes the playoffs. That's 16 teams. You have an elimination game against the other conference leader, then you play a normal reseeding playoff from there. My reasoning is this: how can you be the best team in the country if you are not even the best team in your conference? In a massive conference, there are many circumstances in which the best team might not win the conference championship, but when everyone plays everyone, that removes all doubt. Maybe in some 3-way tie scenario where the team that drew the short straw beat the eventual conference champion, there could be real controversy. But getting screwed by a mathematical tiebreaker is much fairer and predictable than getting screwed by a bunch of journalists. Now that we all agree, time to schedule. Our postseason starts in week 15 with 8 conference championship games held at regional neutral sites. Then, our quarterfinals are held the weekends before Christmas in 4 rotating warm weather or domed venues. Then our 2 semifinals are held at the New Year's Six, rotating of course, with the other 4 taking conference runners-up or at-large bids. Then after a bye week, the finals play for the national championship in a rotating warm weather or domed venue. As for everyone else, teams that don't get to the playoffs will still be eligible for bowls. I want to get rid of cupcake games to increase interconference competition, so no more FCS wins for power teams. Then, to reduce the proliferation of F-tier bowl games, raise the bar for group of 5 teams, though give them bonus points for beating power teams. Here's how I would realign the group of 5 to be more geographically compact. The G5 are not a priority in this system, and I don't think they should be in contention for national championships. That is the system. Let's recap. We have 8 geographically compact and reasonably sized conferences which preserve historic rivalries. The smaller conferences play annual ranking games against the same conference-ranked teams in adjacent conferences. The 8 conference champions are seeded by national polls and play a reseeded tournament. Finally, I would adjust bowl eligibility requirements to get rid of cupcake FCS games for power teams, and I would raise the bar for G5 schools to make bowls due to their lighter schedules. With that, thanks for watching. If you liked my idea, like the video. If you think this would ruin college football, dislike the video. Be sure to leave a constructive comment below if you have any thoughts on my conference realignment proposal. And of course, subscribe if you want to see more videos from me. I can't guarantee any will be football related, or they will come out on any consistent basis, but it's the thought that counts.